My name is Ishant Garg, and I am very happy to add this new module on Microsoft Azure SQL Database in my course. Azure SQL Database is Microsoft's main relational database offering in the cloud. I'm going to start the module by explaining why you should consider Azure database offerings. And then I will be comparing a few database offerings available in Microsoft Azure, like Infrastructure as a Service, IaaS, or Platform as a Service, PaaS. Azure SQL Database is a DB as a service offering. You need to be aware of a few concepts when provisioning a new instance of Azure SQL Database. The first important concept is a deployment option. We are going to talk about single database, elastic pool, and managed instance deployment options. We will talk about the strengths and the limitations of each deployment option so you can see which one might be the right deployment option for you. And then we will go into detail about Azure SQL Database IaaS deployment option, that is a SQL Server in virtual machine. We will discuss how this option is convenient to easy lift and shift for on-premises database. We will also go through demo to provision database in virtual machine. Then we will talk about in detail for Azure SQL Database single database deployment option. We will talk about properties of this deployment option and its use cases. We will also cover some important concepts like purchasing model and service tier. There are two purchasing models that can be used when deploying a new instance of Azure SQL Database: Virtual Core and DTU. We are going to take a look at each of these purchasing models. And we are going to talk about multiple service tiers available for these purchasing models. We have general purpose, business critical, and hyperscale. From user perspective, Azure Database and Data Warehouse both look same, but they are very different behind the scene. So we will discuss the difference. Then we are going to talk about Azure SQL Database Elastic Pool Deployment option. This is an interesting deployment option which can help you save a lot of money. We will see when it makes sense to choose elastic pools as your preferred deployment option. Then I will be explaining Azure SQL Database Managed Instance. We will see what are the use cases for this deployment option. And also, we will talk about differences between SQL Server on-premises and this deployment option. We will also cover the management operations concerning managed instance. These operations include create, update, and delete. We will see how long these operations will take. And in the module's demo, we are going to provision an Azure SQL Server managed instance. And we will create a virtual machine in a private network to connect this instance. And we will create a virtual machine in a private network to connect to this instance. We will also see how to secure these deployment options. Microsoft Azure provides us with a few technologies which can be used to secure your Azure SQL database instances. We are going to talk about the firewalls, Azure Active Directory integration, managed identities, always encrypted, and transparent data encryption. And we will also look at the security options dedicated for managed instances, like advanced security options for managed instance. As you see, we have a lot to cover, so let's get into it. And I'm expecting you to have a basic familiarity with the Azure portal and a basic understanding of database. Thank you. Hello everyone. Welcome to this section on Azure SQL Database offering. I'm going to start the section by explaining why you should consider Azure database offerings and comparing a few database offerings available in Microsoft Azure, like Infrastructure as a Service or IaaS and Platform as a Service or PaaS. We will take a look at pros and cons of each of these offerings. Azure SQL Database is a database as a service offering. You need to be aware of a few concepts when provisioning a new instance of Azure SQL Database. The first important concept is a deployment option. We are going to talk about single database, elastic pool, and managed instance deployment options. We will talk about strengths and limitations of each deployment option so you can see which one might be the right deployment option for you. Let's get into it. So, what is Azure SQL Database? Azure SQL Database is a relational database as a service in the cloud with mission critical capabilities. Think of it as an enterprise ready SQL Server engine that can handle your most critical workload. Azure SQL Database is a fully managed service, and this saves a lot of valuable time which we can use to unlock new opportunities. We can focus on developing new features and then innovations instead of managing database and worry about the maintenance and administrative stuff. Azure SQL Database provides predictable performance and pricing. You pay for the performance tier that your workload needs, and you're guaranteed a reliable and steady compute environment. Azure SQL Database includes a feature called Elastic Pools. This enables you to have a pool of resources, known as EDTUs, that a group of databases can use. This feature allows you to purchase a large level of compute that multiple databases can use, rather than having to provision at a per database level. Azure SQL Database also includes 4 nines of uptime. That means 99.99% built into the product. Would you be able to achieve that in your own data center? Very difficult. 99.99 uptime allows for only 52 minutes of downtime per year, or 4.38 minutes per month. And that is protected by financially backed SLA. Another interesting feature is a geo-replication. Geo-replication is now available in all pricing tiers of Azure SQL Database to keep your database redundant in another region. These secondaries can be used for high availability or disaster recovery. Connecting your existing applications to Azure SQL Database is very easy. It supports existing SQL Server tools, libraries, and APIs. To me, one of the biggest advantages of Azure SQL Database is the ability to scale with no downtime. If you need more DTU for performance, you can easily select a larger DTU unit and it seamlessly migrate. Security was a primary focus when creating Azure SQL Database. There are several features to help ensure your data is protected. Features like row-level security, transparent data encryption, always encrypted, dynamic data masking, and so on. Azure gives you two options to run SQL Server-based workloads. The first option is a infrastructure as a service. That means to provision a SQL Server installation on an Azure virtual machine. This is a SQL Server inside a fully managed virtual machine in Azure. You don't need to worry about the physical machine. Many aspects of this virtual machine, like the disk, are fully managed by Azure. So it is much easier than completely managing your own virtual machine or your own computer box. However, after all, it is still a virtual machine and you need to manage the instance of SQL Server manually. The other option is Platform as a Service or Database as a Service offering. You simply create a resource of type Azure SQL Database and create your database and tables in this instance. You don't need to worry about getting a computer, installing operating system, or installing the database engine, patching the operating system, or scaling your database. All of these taken care of by the Microsoft Azure. So how would you choose between these two options? There is one important question that you need to answer. Do you want to manually manage your database engine, apply patches, take backups, and so on? Or you prefer to delegate these operations to Azure? Let's take a look at these two different kinds of offerings in more detail. SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine is an infrastructure as a service or IaaS offering. This allows you to run SQL Server inside a fully managed virtual machine in Azure. You might want to choose this option for migrating on-premises SQL Server databases and applications without any database change. This is lift and shift scenario. The SQL Server installed on a virtual machine is identical to the SQL Server you have installed on premises. Also, this option gives you full control over the database engine. You can control the timings of maintenance or patching of your database engine. You can also pause or stop the virtual machine whenever you don't need the SQL Server to save some cost. And this option is fully customizable. Means you can easily go with the pay-as-you-go model, or you can also bring your existing license to save some money. On the other hand, Azure SQL Database is a relational database as a service hosted in Azure. Database as a service falls into a platform as a service or PaaS offering. Using Azure SQL Database, you can benefit from some features that are not available even in on-premises SQL Server, such as built-in high availability, intelligence, and database management tools. Using Azure SQL Database, you go with the pay-as-you-go model. It also gives you the option to scale up or scale out for greater power when needed. In most cases, scale up or scaling out cause no interruption in the service, which is good option for highly available applications. Azure SQL Database has multiple deployment options, purchasing models, and service tiers. In the upcoming lectures, we will see all this into more details. Let's go over what is your responsibility when you deploy SQL Server in a virtual machine as opposed to when you deploy a database in Azure SQL Database. In virtual machine, you have to maintain the operating system. Now, as a DBA, you may not be doing it by yourself, but someone else, maybe a system engineers in your company, will be doing it. And there's definitely a cost for it. You also have to maintain SQL Server. That means that you have to make sure that the database engine is properly patched. For example, you have to be able to set up backups and you have to be able to make sure that they actually work when you can restore from them. High availability is also your responsibility, and there are many technologies that you can choose from. Disaster recovery as well is your responsibility. And many companies don't even implement disaster recovery just because of the cost in management and in infrastructure to have a disaster recovery site available. Performance, of course, is your responsibility as a DBA. Change control is your responsibility Every time that you make a configuration change, you are responsible for that change, and you have to make sure that you test it. And finally, security. A very hot topic nowadays is your responsibility too. You have to manage the users, the roles, and general access to your SQL Server and the database inside. Now let's see how that contrasts with the Azure SQL Database. Well, the main responsibility for you is to choose the right service tier to begin with, as that will define the features, performance, and recovery characteristics of the database. After that, Azure SQL Database will provide high availability and disaster recovery capabilities. Your responsibility is to test your application with those capabilities and make sure that everything will work correctly in the case of a disaster. For performance, Azure SQL's database has many inbuilt tools which provide you with the report and the other indicators and the data. But ultimately, is it still will be your responsibility? As SQL Server database can't anticipate every single query that is going on to against your database. So you have to make sure that performance is acceptable for your applications and your users, and you still might have to do index tuning and SQL tuning and all. Change control, of course, is still your responsibility. If you do any changes in schema, in configuration of the SQL database, you have to be the one responsible for testing them. And again, Azure SQL Database provide many tools to handle the security, but ultimately it is still your responsibility, whether it's to create a new logins or roles or database users, that will still be under your control. Now, let's look at the benefits of both database offerings. For the SQL Server on a virtual machine, Microsoft guarantees 99.95% availability. As you saw, we have full control over the SQL Server engine. There's a full parity with the matching version of on-premises SQL Server. This means easy migration from SQL Server to on-premises to Azure. You can place the SQL Server virtual machine inside a virtual network subnet and assign a private IP address to this virtual machine. This makes your SQL Server installation more secure. For the Azure SQL Database or the PaaS model, Microsoft guarantees 99.99% availability. The most commonly used SQL Server features are available in Azure SQL Database. Also, Microsoft Azure takes care of the backup, patching, and recovery. You don't need to worry about creating a backups or do the patching or perform recovery manually. If you need to, you have the ability to assign necessary resources, for example, CPU and storage, to individual databases. There is built-in advanced intelligence and security. And finally, you can scale down, up, in or out without any downtime. Pool that can then share that bucket of resources assigned to the elastic pool. The benefit here is that each, as we discussed in previous lecture, that LAS has deployment option in virtual machine. Platform as a service or PaaS has further three different deployment options: single database, elastic pool database, and managed instance. So in this lecture, we will be discussing these three PaaS deployment options. So single database is the first deployment option offered by Azure SQL Database. And this is exactly what the name suggests. This is a single isolated database that is perfect for applications that need a single data source. We create this against a database server, and it has its own set of assigned resources. This could be in terms of a database transaction unit, a DTU, or it could be vCores with an amount of disk space. We will discuss all this in great detail in the upcoming lectures. There is still a concept of SQL Server, but this is very much a logical concept. We don't do much at the SQL Server level other than, for example, the firewall rules. In the single database scenario, each database receives its own guaranteed compute, memory, and storage. Elastic Pool is the other deployment option for Azure SQL Database. An elastic pool is a collection of single databases with a shared set of resources, such as CPU or memory. We create an elastic pool against that logical database server. The elastic pool has a set of resources assigned to it, and then we can create multiple databases within that elastic pool that can then share that bucket of resources assigned to the elastic pool. The benefit here is that each database could have varying level of resource requirement at different times because it's sharing that pool. In the elastic pool scenario, there's a fixed amount of resources which will be shared by all the databases in the pool. And finally, the most recent deployment option offered by Azure SQL Database is a managed instance. A managed instance is a set of databases that can be used together. This is the closest deployment option of the last scenario offered by Azure SQL Database. This means easy migration from on-premises databases. This is a dedicated instance of SQL Server running in your virtual network. I have the managed instance server, which is different from the logical servers used for single database and elastic pool. And then on that managed instance database server, there are instance databases. Now the resources are provisioned at the managed instance database server level. And then all of the instance databases running on that managed instance database server share whatever resources are available. So I have this collection of database running on a dedicated instance of SQL Server for my environment. And finally, as I said, each managed instance has its guaranteed resources. SQL Server in virtual machine. We will discuss how. Hello everyone. Welcome to this section on Azure SQL Database in virtual machine. In this section, I will talk about Azure SQL Database IaaS deployment option, that is SQL Server in virtual machine. We will discuss how this option is convenient to easy lift and shift for on-premises database. We will also go through demo to provision database in virtual machine. In this lesson, we will discuss last database offering of Azure, which is SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine. SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines enables you to use full versions of SQL Server in the cloud without having to manage any on-premises hardware. You can create virtual machines in many different geographic regions around the world. They also offer a variety of machine sizes. The virtual machine image gallery allows you to create a SQL Server virtual machine with the right version, edition, and operating system. This makes virtual machine a very good option for many different SQL Server workloads. SQL Server Azure Virtual Machine can use automated patching to schedule a maintenance window for installing important Windows and SQL Server updates automatically. SQL Server Azure Virtual Machine can take advantage of automatic backup, which regularly creates backups of your database to blob storage. You can also manually use this technique. If you require high availability, consider configuring SQL Server availability groups. This involves multiple SQL Server Azure virtual machines in a virtual network. You can configure your high availability solution manually, or you can use templates in the Azure portal for automatic configuration. Azure Virtual Machines offer different machine sizes to meet various workload demands. SQL Virtual Machines also provide automatic storage configuration, which is optimized for your performance requirements. All right, demo time. In this demo, I'm going to provision a SQL Server instance in a managed virtual machine. As we discussed, this is the last scenario, which is one of the Azure offerings to run SQL Server workloads. So click on Create Resources and search for SQL Server. As you can see, I have several SQL Server workloads which I can choose from, but I'm looking for images published by Microsoft. So let's click on Publisher and choose Microsoft. I get all the SQL Server images published by Microsoft. Let's go ahead and choose SQL Server 2016 Service Pack 1 on Windows Server 2016. Let's click on that. And let's choose a software plan. I can choose from free licenses dedicated to developers or from enterprise licenses. But please note that you will still be charged for a virtual machine and Windows installed on it. The SQL Server license will be free. Let's choose the free developer license and click on Create. And here we need to go through a wizard to provision our managed virtual machine. So let's choose my resource group, which I created earlier. So I'm going to add my virtual machine to this resource group. And I am going to give name to my virtual machine. And I will put this virtual machine closer to my location. Here I have option to put my virtual machine in an availability zone or availability set. However, for this purpose of this demo, I don't need to provision any availability. So let's choose no infrastructure redundancy. And in this next step, we need to choose our image. So click on that. I'm going to choose the free license SQL Server 2016 developer. Azure Spot instance. Azure Spot offers unused Azure capacity at a discounted rate versus pay-as-you-go prices. So we are going to delete these resources after demo anyway. So let's choose no for this demo. Now we also have option to change the size of our virtual machine. So let's click on change size. And as you can see here, I can choose from many sizes available to me. I'm going to choose B2MS general purpose and click on select. In the next step, we need to choose our administrative account. This is the account we will be using for window authentication. So in the next step, we need to specify which inbound ports you want to open. For example, we need to remote desktop to this machine. We need to make sure the RTP port is open. So let's click on that. and select the inbound port we want to open. And as you can see, the RDP is already selected by default. Please note that for a SQL Server production virtual machine, you might not want to allow RDP on a public IP address. However, for the purpose of this demo, we should be fine. And moving forward, we don't need to specify if we already have a window license, which my answer is no. So let's click on next to disk. Here you can choose what kind of disk you want to assign to your virtual machine. You can choose from premium SSD, standard SSD, or standard HDD. I'm going to choose the standard SSD for this demo and click on next to networking. So your virtual machine will be added to the virtual network. You can choose your pre-existing virtual network or let Azure create a new virtual network and subnet for you. I'm going to leave all the defaults as they are and move next to the management. And here again, I will not touch anything and will leave all the default settings. Please note that here we need to choose the diagnostic storage account. So diagnostic storage account is a mandatory setting. So let's create one, storage virtual machine 108. And let's move next to the advanced settings. And once again, I will not change anything and we'll leave everything to default and move next to the SQL Server Settings. So in the SQL Server Setting page, you can choose the type of SQL connectivity. You can choose local, private, or public. For the purpose of this demo, I'm going to choose public. However, this might not be the very best option for your production system. I can leave this standard SQL Server port, which is 1433. I mean, you can choose a different port to be used for your database. Let's move down, and in this next step, let's enable a SQL Authentication. And as you can see that by enabling this option, you automatically get the same login name and password you choose for your Windows operating system. I'm going to leave all the options as they are, scroll down, and go to next, which is tag. I don't need to assign tags to my machine. So let's review and create. Looks like the validation has passed. And we can see all options which we choose during this wizard here. And so finally, I can click on create and provision my virtual machine. It will take some time. Let's wait for the provision to finish. I will come back maybe in 10 minutes. Meanwhile, hopefully this will be completed. All right, my deployment is done. So let's go ahead and take a look at our virtual machine. Let's click on go to resources. And as you can see, I am in the dashboard of my SQL Server virtual machine. So let's click on connect, and it will give us the option to download RDP file, which we can use to connect to the virtual machine. So download the RDP file for my virtual machine and click on that, connect. So let's see if we can log in using our admin credential, which we created during the wizard. So let's try to connect. And it looks like we are able to connect. So here we go. We are in. So let's search the Management Studio, and select the Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. It is taking some time because I have chosen a small virtual machine size. Let me fast forward this video here. All right, so let's see if I can connect to the local SQL Server engine, which is VM108, using my window credential. Here we go. So now we have connected our database in virtual machine, and if you can see, let's see which version we are in right now. If you remember, while creating, we choose the version 2016. So let's create a new query here and see which version we are in. So as you can see, we are in Microsoft SQL Server 2016 Service Pack 1. And as of now, this is the blank database. We do not have databases. So as we already provisioned and last scenario for SQL Server workload, we have provisioned a virtual machine and a few related resources such as a virtual network, public IP addresses, and network security groups. This gives you a great flexibility because you have control over all aspects of your virtual machine and the network your virtual machine lives in. It also increases your responsibility and the time you need to spend on administrative tasks. And this is why you might want to choose the Azure SQL Database, which is the past scenario to run SQL Server workloads in Azure. We are going to take a look at this option in the next module. So let's go ahead and close this Management Studio and log off from this virtual machine. Before doing so, let's go ahead and perform the cleanup. I will go into my resource group and I want to delete this resource group because I don't want to get charged for the virtual machine I'm not going to use anymore. So let's delete this resource group. And I created my virtual machine and related resource within this resource group. So this is going to clean up all the resources I created for my last scenario. So I will see you in the next module where we will be discussing Azure SQL Server or the PaaS offering of Azure in database. Thank you.
Hello everyone, welcome to this section on single database on Azure SQL Database Service. I will start the section by talking about Azure SQL Database single database deployment option. We will talk about properties of this deployment option and its use cases. We will also cover some important concepts like purchasing model and service tier. There are two purchasing models that we can choose when deploying a new instance of Azure SQL Database, Virtual Core and DTU. We are going to take a look at each of these purchasing models. And we are going to talk about multiple service tiers available for these purchasing models. We have general purpose, business critical, and hyperscale. From a user perspective, Azure Database and Data Warehouse both look same, but they are very different behind the scene. So we will discuss the differences. All right, let's get into it. And here, as you can see, I can choose between the basic, standard, and premium service tier. Let's click on standard. I can assign a fixed amount of DTUs and data size to my database. Same goes with the premium. Single database has its own set of guaranteed resources. These resources will not be shared with other databases in Azure. So you can be sure the resources you are assigning to your single database are only used for your database and are available when they are needed. Again, we'll be discussing all this in great detail in the upcoming lessons. So as of now, let's choose the standard plan and click apply. So let's go next to the networking and choose the connectivity method. And here I will be choosing the public endpoint and give firewall access. By the way, we can change these settings later also. So let's click on additional settings. Here I have the option to create an empty database, or I can create a database from an existing backup, or put an sample database inside my new Azure SQL instances. I'm going to put a sample inside this instance and leave the other settings as a default and go to the next as a tags. And I'm not going to assign any tags to this SQL instance. However, it is a good idea to assign appropriate tags to your SQL resources so it can get reports for the purpose of billing and cost. I'm not going to add any tags to this instance. We can do this later also if required. So let's click on review and create. Here you can see the monthly cost of our SQL database and all of the settings we just selected. Click on create and let's wait for the provision to finish. I will pause this video here and we'll come back once it is completed. Okay, so after about 2 or 3 minutes, my deployment is completed. Let's click on go to resources. And here I'm landed in my new SQL Server dashboard. As you can see, I have a new server created for me as well. Let's click on that. And I am in the logical SQL Server dashboard now. So under settings, I have control over different aspects of my logical server. I can manage the backups. I can assign Azure Active Directory administrators. I can see all the databases in that server. I also have option to take a look at the deleted databases. Clicking on SQL Server Database, we can see all the databases inside this SQL Server. And as you can see, as of now, we only have one database. But if you go to the overview, we can create other databases inside this server also. And each database is isolated from each other and are portable. For example, if you create two Azure SQL database instances under the same SQL database server, these two databases are totally isolated from each other and cannot communicate. This could be a preferred security feature. So let's click on the SQL databases. Let's click on DB108, our database, and now we are back to the portal of our database. Now I want to show you that how we can query this brand new database we just created. So go to the query editor and provide server credentials. You remember I have mentioned that server account and password have administrative rights to all the database inside it. So I'm able to log in here now because if you remember, while creating this database, I gave the firewall access. But if you're getting the firewall access error,
Let's quickly go to the server once again and search for firewall in security. Now, by default, server firewall prevents all the client applications from connecting to the server or any database inside the server unless you create an IP firewall rule to open the firewall. For a connection from an IP address outside Azure, we need to create a firewall rule for a specific IP address or a range of addresses that you want to able to connect. Now here Azure shows our IP address, and you can see my IP address is already added because I added it while creating the database. But if your IP address is not here, you can just click on add client IP and it will add this IP address into the firewall rule, and just click on save, and that's it. So I will disregard because my IP address is already here. And let's go back to our database here and try to connect once again using our server credential. All right, so we are in. So if you remember, we selected to have a sample database while creating this database. And so we can see the sample tables here. And you can select any table here and you can select some data from these tables and then you can see the result. Now, let's go ahead and connect to this database from a local SQL Server Management Studio. So here I'm in my Management Studio. I'll click on Connect, and here I will put my server name, which I can get from here. This is my server name. And of course, I'm going to use my administrative login ID and password to connect to this server. And here you see that it looks like I'm able to connect to this server. But if your local IP is not added or not whitelisted in firewall IP addresses list, you are going to get the error here. So let me tell you where you can go and fix that error. So once again, it's the same place. Go to the server, go to the security, and go to the firewall and virtual networks. And if you remember, we added our local IP address here. I want to talk a little bit more about this. So if you get the firewall error, you have two options. Either you can log in into your Azure account from within the Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. So it will go ahead and automatically add your local IP address. And other option is you come here in the firewall and virtual network setting of a server, and you can see here the first option is this toggle button. This is the same checkbox we had when we provisioning our logical server. You will want to turn this option on if you have Azure services which want to connect to this Azure SQL database. For example, applications running inside a virtual machine or app services. I'm going to leave this option on for this demo. So by default, all the IP addresses are blacklisted from Azure SQL database. So we need to initiate a request to add IP addresses to our Azure SQL database. So as I showed you earlier, we can simply click on add client IP and it will add your local IP address into the firewall. And let's scroll down a little bit below and take a look at another security option in the firewall. So here I have option to allow access from resources deployed to existing or new virtual networks. This is extremely useful because it allows me to control which private service can connect to my SQL database. So I'm going to click on create new virtual network, and here I have the option to create a new virtual network and have it whitelisted in my firewall setting. Then I can go ahead and deploy a few resources, and all those resources can in turn use my Azure SQL database. So I'm not going to do that for this demo here. Let's go back to my management studio. And as you can see, while creating this database, we choose a sample database, and we have all those tables, sample tables here, and we can select data from any of these tables here. Now, in this lesson, we will discuss purchasing models and service tier in more detail. So let's try to add one more database on the server we created in last lesson. So let's go to the overview and go to the server. So now we are in the server portal, and here we have option to add new database. And here we can choose the database name and then source. Let's choose a blank database server, elastic pool setting, and finally we have to choose here the pricing tier. This is what we are going to discuss in this lecture. So if I click on pricing tier, we have two purchasing model, DTU and vCore based model. Within the DTU, there are three tiers: basic, standard, and premium. And if we switch to the vCore based purchasing options, we also have three service tiers options: general purpose, hyperscale, and business critical. As you can see in this diagram, we have two purchasing models, DTU and vCore, and three service tiers in each. Microsoft describes DTU as a blended measure of CPU, memory, and I/O. This guarantees a certain level of compute, storage, and I/O resources. You assign a bundle of resources to your Azure SQL database. You cannot adjust individual resources such as compute or memory. 100 DTU is twice as much as 50 DTU, and 200 DTU is twice as much as 100 DTU. Calculating with DTUs is relatively simple. You primarily need to compare them and evaluate what each compute size offers. These compute sizes are available within the service tiers like basic, standard, and premium. Each tier consists of multiple sizes, and each size provides varying scale of not just DTU but maximum database sizing, storage capacity, and storage performance. The other purchasing model is the vCore based purchasing model, which is newer offering comparing to DTU based. This purchasing model gives you the option to choose between generations of hardware, number of CPU cores, memory, and storage size. In this purchasing model, you have more flexibility in adjusting individual resources, such as CPU, memory, or storage. It is designed to address the fine-tuning of CPU power and storage performance separately and in a more transparent way. Microsoft recommends vCore-based purchasing model. So let's compare these two purchasing models in more detail. The vCore-based purchasing model is supported by all three deployment options, including single database, elastic pools, and managed instance. On the other hand, DTU-based purchasing model is only supported by single database and elastic pool. The vCore-based model is best for customers who need flexibility, control, and transparency. As you saw in this model, you have the flexibility to adjust individual resources such as CPU, memory, and storage. The DTU-based model is best for customers who want simple and pre-configured resource options. The vCore-based model gives you a straightforward way to translate on-premises workloads to the cloud. You know how much resources you use on your on-premises server. You can easily translate those resources to the corresponding value of the vCore-based model.
However, you might need to calculate the needed amount of DTUs before migration from your on-premises database. There are tools such as DTU Calculator which you can use for this purpose. Microsoft recommends the virtual core based model. However, if the DTU based purchasing model meets your performance and business requirement, you should continue using it. You are not obliged to change to the virtual core purchasing model. There are scenarios that you might want to consider converting DTU based model to the vCore based. If your single database or elastic pool consumes more than 300 DTUs, converting to the vCore based model might reduce your cost. You can convert to the vCore based model by using your API of choice, meaning Azure CLI, RESTful API, or PowerShell, or by using the Azure portal. And there is no downtime. And as we mentioned before, Azure SQL Database Managed Instance only supports vCore based purchasing model. So if you are going with this deployment option, you have to choose vCore based purchasing model. So far, we talked about the Azure SQL Database deployment options and purchasing models. The last concept to cover is Azure SQL Database service tiers. There are three service tiers for Azure SQL Database. The first one is the general purpose or standard. This service tier is designed for most generic workloads. Microsoft guarantees 4.9 SLA. Regarding the storage speed, there is a 2 millisecond read latency and 10 millisecond write latency. This performance is good enough for most workloads. The other service tier is the business critical or premium. This service tier is designed for applications requiring low latency. Same as the general purpose tier, Microsoft guarantees 4 nines of SLA. However, the storage is much faster in this service tier. There is 1 millisecond read latency and 2 millisecond of writing latency. Both these service tiers are available for all the deployment options. The last service tier is Hyperscale. This is primarily intended for customers who have large database up to 100 terabyte in size. The other two service tiers, general purpose and business critical, are host databases up to 4 terabyte in size. Keep in mind that the Hyperscale service tier is only available for the vCore purchasing model, and basic service model is only available in DTU purchasing model. So let's recap. In this module, we talked about three important Azure SQL Database concepts. The first one is the deployment option. You can choose from single database, elastic pool, or managed instance. After choosing the deployment option, you need to choose a purchasing model. You can choose from DTU based or vCore based. The DTU based purchasing model is only available for single database and elastic pool. The vCore based purchasing model is available for all the deployment options. After decided the purchasing model, you need to decide the service tiers. You can choose among general purpose or standard, business critical or premium, and hyperscale. The hyperscale service tier is only available for the vCore based purchasing model. Now let's go back to the portal. Microsoft recommends using the vCore purchasing model, and that's why I'm getting the vCore purchasing model general purpose as my default. I could easily go ahead between different services tiers, including the hyperscale or business critical. But for this demo, I'm going to use the general purpose. So let's click on that and scroll down. So here I can decide how many virtual cores I am going to assign to my database. The default is 2 virtual cores. I can just use
the slider and to go with the higher number of virtual cores if I need to. So I'm going to leave that vcore value to 2, and 32 GB of storage is more than enough for me. The other options you can control is to choose between compute generations. You can use from generation 4 or generation 5. Generation 4 gives you up to 24 virtual cores and 168 gigabyte of memory. Generation 5 gives you up to 80 number of virtual core and up to 408 gigabyte of memory. I'm going to choose generation 5. Click OK. Now, one of the new concepts offered by Azure for Azure SQL Database is the compute tier. I can choose between the more traditional provisioned tier or the new serverless tier. So the provision is the model we used so far. You know how much resources your database needs, including CPU, memory, and storage. So just go ahead and provision them. But the serverless tier is more interesting. In the serverless tier, Azure decides how much resources it needs to assign to your database. So if your database needs more resources, it automatically gets them. So let's click on serverless and see how our options change. First of all, by choosing serverless, I only have compute generation 5 available for me. So if you look here, there is no generation 4 here. And here I can get up to 16 virtual cores and 48 GB of memory. And here I can also assign the minimum vcores and maximum vcores I'm willing to assign to my database. So let's slide the 2 virtual core as my maximum, and I'm going to assign 1 to my minimum virtual core. So this means Azure is going to decide how many virtual core is assigned to my database based on the database load. The amount of virtual cores will not be less than 1 virtual core and won't be more than 2 virtual cores. So this is the nice feature because you can assign how big your database can become. And this is a way to control your cost. So now you also have the option to choose the DTU-based purchasing model. To do so, simply click on looking for basic, standard, and premium link. Let's click on that, and here you can choose between the basic, standard, and premium service tiers. Standard is equivalent to the general purpose of vCore, and premium is similar to the business critical of the vCore model. So let's click on standard. You can set the exact number of DTUs and storage you like to assign to your database. The same goes with the premium. You won't have the access to the serverless option in this purchasing model. So let's click on vCore based purchasing options once again and make sure you're going with the vCore purchasing model. And here we are once again in the vCore purchasing model. Here we have the general purpose. I can choose provisioned and vCore 2 and max data max size 3. And we also notice here the how much it is going to cost us. So this setting is going to cost us $426.29 per month. We click on apply.
I just want to make sure you know that even though Azure SQL Server and Azure SQL Data Warehouse look same, but behind the scene, they are different. The biggest difference between Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Data Warehouse is the fact that Azure SQL Database deal with OLTP or online transaction processing and optimized for create, read, update, delete, or basically crude operations, more of a row level operation or granular queries like row update, new row, etc. SQL Data Warehouse is for online analytical processing, OLAP. It is optimized for robust queries to process and produce reports. The idea with the Azure SQL Data Warehouse is that it's more of an analytics place where you have got the data that may be less frequently updated, but you are going to run detailed and potentially complex queries and reports based on it. Azure SQL Database is symmetric multiprocessing, where you have got a single virtual server that you can scale up or down. Azure SQL Data Warehouse is for massively parallel processing. Azure SQL Data Warehouse has 60 compute nodes that you spread your data across through horizontal partitioning, where you break numerous tables into sections and put them on separate hosts. It is a lot easier to do that in the cloud when you are not provisioning all the hardware by yourself. So therefore, with Azure SQL Database, you have got vertical scale. With Azure SQL Data Warehouse, you have got horizontal scale. Another neat thing about Azure SQL Data Warehouse is that you can pause the cluster node to save some cost. This is nice. It's nice that Microsoft gives you the ability because SQL Data Warehouse can be very pricey. It's a premier hosted platform for data warehousing. And finally, we have Polybase for data warehousing. Hello everyone, welcome to this section on Elastic Database Pool on Azure SQL Database Service. We are going to talk about Azure SQL Database Elastic Pool deployment option. This is an interesting deployment option which can help you save a lot of money. We will see when it makes sense to choose Elastic Pools as your preferred deployment option. And we will go through demo to provision Elastic Pool where we will be creating multiple databases and will configure them in Elastic Pool. Alright, so let's get into it. In previous lecture, we discussed the most common way of deployment, that is single database option. When you select a single database, Azure deploys one database that runs in its own reserved resources. Let's talk about Azure SQL Database Elastic Pools. An Azure SQL Elastic Pool allows you to allocate a shared set of compute resources to a collection of Azure SQL databases, meaning that your databases are running in a shared resource pool. A large organization might have a number of databases that are hard to size because they are new, and their resource utilization is also unpredictable, sometimes needing a lot of DTUs and sometimes needing only a few. The following figure shows an example of a database that spends much time idle, but also periodically spikes with activity. This is utilization pattern that is more suited for a pool. For the 5-minute period illustrated, DB1 peaks to 90 DTU, but its overall average usage is less than 5 DTUs. If we let it run as a single database, this leaves most of the resources unused during periods of low activity. In this case, Microsoft offers an alternative to a single database. The Elastic Pool is a collection of databases that share eDTUs and Elastic DTUs. This is a similar kind of measure, but not instead of being applied to a single database, an EDTU applies to a pool of databases that share resources in an elastic pool, measuring the performance potential of the entire pool instead of a single database. Each database in the pool is capable of using a few or lots of entire pool's performance capacity. If a single database needs to have a burst in performance, it can do so within the constraints of the pool. This would impact other databases in the same pool, but has no impact on any database outside the pool. If you look at this figure, the
Yes,
aggregate DTU
yes, Nandini.
utilization across all 20
Yeah, I
databases
think
is
so. Today we will
illustrated
see
by the black line.
project
This shows
explanation.
that
Means like in
the
projects, what
aggregate
and all it will be
DTU
there,
utilization
right?
never
So,
exceeds
so what
100
are the
DTUs
things you should be
and
familiar with?
indicates that
So
the
those
20
things I will say
databases
so
can
that
share
we can
100
easily go
EDTUs
and
over this
move
time
forward
period.
in this one.
This
So if you have any
results
doubts,
in
you
a
can let
20
me know
times
little
reduction
later
in
on also.
DTUs and a
Okay.
13
So
times
mostly I
price
have given all
reduction
of them.
compared
So you
to
may go through
placing
some of
each
the
of the
tasks also.
databases
So
in as
basically,
a single
in the
databases.
companies wise,
This
right, we will have
example
two
is
types of
ideal
companies will
for
be
the
there:
following
product-based
reasons.
companies and
There are large
service-based
differences
companies.
between peak
Okay, so
utilization
we have
and average
generally like two types
utilization
of
per
companies.
database.
So product and service-based companies.